When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadavji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 34, The Devastation and Stigma of a Parent's Divorce and the Unknown Mental Health Crisis. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our amazing and daring guest, Christine Yerrill. Christine has been a valued member of the LifeWorks by Morneau Chappelle team since 2002 in both client-facing and people leadership roles. She currently holds the role of Director, Public Safety Development, focused on the needs of the first responder sector. She has served over 19 years in the organization, ensuring the LifeWorks services meets employers' needs. Her clients have included some of Canada's largest unionized employers. In her role, Christine brings her ability to engage wellness and leadership stakeholders, problem solve, educate, and build trusting relationships. This includes oversight of program design, implementation and management, communications, and recommendations for prevention strategies. She develops strong partnerships with prospective clients and stakeholders, delivers constructive evaluations of programs, and demonstrates the positive impact of LifeWorks services for members and employees. Christine is the creator, producer, and co-writer of Heartbeat webinar series, LifeWorks, by Morneau Chappelle's monthly client-facing talk radio-style education and sales webinar series, delivering content to organizational leaders on human resource content, including mental health. She is the winner of 4 Employee Assistance Society of North America Corporate Awards of Excellence for her work with Peel Regional Police in 2014, Ontario Power Generation, both 2011 and 2018, Atomic Energy of Canada, 2012. Well. Hello, Christine. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Thank you very much, Salima. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh my goodness. Christine, I'm just looking forward to have this chat with you today. I am pumped and ready to go to chat about all things daring, all things deep. And, I'm really excited and actually really grateful that you are on this platform with me with full willingness to share and be open to talk about something that often doesn't get spoken about. So I really appreciate your support for taking this stance with me to help break down barriers of mental stigma.
Well, thanks for having me. I wouldn't say anybody in my life would describe me as a daredevil, but today I'm going to take that moniker.
Today, you are a daredevil. I love it. So, Christine, in case you're still wondering, with this podcast, it's about bringing forward untold stories that people go through, whether it's directly about a mental health struggle or not. One thing that we know is that there's always impact to someone's mental health And that's the part of their story that usually really typically remains tucked away. So the purpose of this platform was meant to, or is meant to, serve as a way to break barriers of mental stigma that have been conditioned in our society. So the aim here, my quest, is our conversation today, the presence of us coming together and having this chat, this conversation, is really to encourage people to come forward, to share and tell what people typically don't want to unveil, that they keep tucked away and don't express. And of course, I'm bringing forward a new trend. It's called the mental beauty rethink. What do you think about the mental beauty rethink?
I think that's an interesting idea. I don't think many people think of their mental health as something that's beautiful. People talk about their mental health
Mm-hmm.
when it's in a bad place. It's a wilted flower in the garden, and people are not feeling their best. But with a little care, all things come back to life. So I like the idea of mental beauty.
Oh, that's great. I really like how you said that. People sometimes only think about mental health when it's a negative state. So it's true, and I think it's about embrace. For me, it's about embracing all parts of health, physical health, mental health, but also embracing the good, bad, and ugly as all part of it being beautiful. Because life is imperfect and things are imperfect, but it can still be beautiful.
Yeah, and I think all those parts are equally important, right? If one's out of balance, the rest are not in a good place either.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, so I'm ready to get down to all my questions. How about you?
Sounds good. I'm feeling daring.
I love it, Miss Daredevil. Miss Daredevil Christine, give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. What would it say?
I think it would say depression isn't a place, it's a journey.
Depression isn't a place, it's a journey. Okay.
I think sometimes people think that, if they struggle with depression, that's a permanent state of mind, or it's a lifelong sentence that they're going to struggle with their entire life, and that's not really my experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like a place I visit from time to time.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting way of saying, it's something that you visit from time to time. I'm going to use that in my client sessions.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like any journey, there's an element of choice in it, but there's also an element in I find it helpful thinking of the journey as I choose the directions too. So I make choices in my life every day that will contribute to me ending up in that destination again, or could help me avoid being in that destination again. And I have to be very conscious about that. Kind of back to your idea of health and all the areas of health.
And part of looking at the journey, I find, is really about your awareness, right? So the more awareness you build, the more you're able to make choices that are more helpful for you. And the more and more you're aware, the more and more you're learning about yourself, it's easier to know what choices are good for you that you might not have known before.
Yes. The wisdom of age, I think, is part of that too.
Yes, for sure. Okay, Christine. So tell us, what is your untold story all about?
So, I think that the untold story in the background of my life is that as a child, my parents divorced. And, that is not, as we were talking earlier, not an uncommon story. So, divorce happens in a lot of people's lives. Given we're a podcast, not visual, I'll share I'm in my mid 50s now. So, when my parents made the decision to separate and divorce was not common. And in fact, I was the first person who in our neighborhood, which when you're I was a child, I was about 8 or 9 at the time. Um, I was the first person in our neighborhood that had ever had parents that had separated or had parents that divorced. I was the only person I knew that had ever had parents that had gone through that. So there was this uh, it was the 70s. There was this sort of stigma associated with my parents. The terminology was the marriage had failed, right? And so there was this sense of failure around their marriage. But I think I interpreted that as well, that our family had failed, and we weren't strong enough to all stay together. And when I talk about my own life, I will share with people, yes, my parents are divorced and they both remarried, and I have this huge extended family because of remarriage and stepbrothers and stepsisters.
Mm-hmm.
But the untold story behind that is that the breakdown of our family unit resulted in me really struggling. I don't tell that part of the story to many people at all. And even I think there are members of my own family, my own immediate family, who don't either were too young to remember or have chosen to kind of pack it away and not talk about it, the impact that it had on my life.
When you had this experience of your parents' divorce, you said you were about 9 years old?
Yeah, I would have been. It would have been the summer I was turning 10, so I was 9 and turning 10.
And so, with that breakdown in that family unit, you had impact. So, what sort of impact did you have? How did it show up for you?
So the the logistics of the divorce resulted in me and my two sisters moving out of our family home and
Hmm.
staying in the neighborhood, but not in the immediate neighborhood where we'd grown up. We were able to stay in the same schools, etc. But for me, the way that it manifested was I s- I had been a really social kid. Like I don't think I would ever have been the most outgoing kid on the block, but I was a social kid, ran with the crowd, and had strong friendships. But I found myself isolated away from the people that I was closest to. You know, the kids next door and the kids across the street, and what would have been my support network at that time. And as well, I just it happened over a summer, and when September came and it was time to go to school, I just could not get up out of bed and go to school. If I did get up, I'd go to school, but I'd find an excuse to leave school. You know, I'd fake illness or tell the teachers I wasn't feeling well so I could go home. And that was back to a house where there was nobody there because my mother had started working. Um, and that continued for a few weeks, and then I was literally just not going to school. I was not getting out of bed until 10 or 11 in the morning after everybody else had got up and done their morning routine, and I would just sit and watch game shows in the morning and soap operas in the afternoon, and my mother would come home from work and the evening activities would start, but I just didn't go to school for a long period of time.
Now you have other siblings you mentioned, right? So
I do.
now how did your siblings cope with this? Like, were you all coping the same way, or did anyone notice? Like, I mean, you weren't going to school, so how did that all come to be? Like, in terms of, I guess, were your parents aware that something was not right? Like, what kind of support did you get?
So I guess siblings and parents would have had different reactions. So I have an older sister, and she's 2 years older than I am. And I think her experience of the divorce was it was almost a relief. So she was a little more conscious of the conflict between my parents just because of her age. And you know, I think it's not uncommon, but she kind of took one side over another, took my mom's side. And so for her, the separation between my mom and my dad was a relief. It was easier for her. So I think that she was in a happier space herself. And so she would look at my reaction. And I can clearly remember one time I was so upset that I decided to write a letter to both of my parents. And, I very carefully copied it out in two copies days before, having a printer in your house where you could just hit print two copies.
Right.
I remember very carefully, as a 10-year-old writing this letter out and then writing another copy of it to go to my dad. And my sister saying, "You can't send that. You can't get in the middle of this. Like, your feelings don't matter in
Hmm.
this."
Hmm.
And kind of telling me to tear it up, telling me to put it away. So she was in a different space. My younger sister is 3 years younger than I am, so she was only, I think, 6.5 or 7 at the time, and I don't think at that age she had any sense of what was
Right.
going on with me. She just knew I was unhappy and wasn't my usual self, and we were pretty close. But she was just one of those siblings that would just kind of be there, cuddle up on the bed with you and read a book or something like that. Yeah. Um, from the parental perspective, my dad was not living with us. So he was, I think, coping with his own sense of loss over the family, alone in the family home, which I'm sure was, as I look back as a parent myself now, I think, gosh, that must have been just horrific. And my mom was deep in the throes of coping with having to run her own life again, not be in a marriage any longer. um, I'm sure dealing with the stigma of, being a divorced woman, and trying to get her career on track. And I think that that was a lot. And uh, I don't blame either of my parents for kind of being oblivious to it, but my mother knew something was wrong for sure. Both my parents did, and um, it resulted in a visit to the family doctor, who was kind of a classic family doctor right out of TV show, like just a kindly older guy, who was a great listener, and kind of drew me out a little bit about how I was feeling. And I think he was aware that it was, you know, I don't know if they would have even labeled it depression then, that I was down, following the divorce and the separation and the changes that had gone on in my life. But they decided that they were going to tell the school that it was mono, that I had mono, and so I probably wouldn't be back at school for several months. So I guess mono was the best the best answer. It was the longest duration disease they could come up with without it being something terminal or fatal
Right.
that would have caused more upset.
Okay. So even your GP kind of tucked that mental health component
Oh, absolutely.
away, of like not telling or speaking about it. Do you feel like it was due to societal norms at the
I
time?
do. I do. I don't. I think that they
Yeah.
worried. Um, it's interesting. I had a visit with my mother very recently, and I listened to her language around mental health. And she worked many as a candy striper. Do you know what candy stripers are? So
Yes.
little teenage volunteers in hospitals. So she had worked as a candy striper in the early 50s in a mental health institution. And her own perceptions of mental health were that they were grave and permanent conditions, right? And did not, they probably both agreed that having that type of label on me was not going to be helpful in my life. And as a result, it was called mono. I giggle about it now, but I remember at the time thinking that's not what it is.
Yeah. How did that make you feel? Did you feel dismissed, or did you feel like no one gets me, or did you feel like, oh, I'm so strange or out there that no one really even knows what to say? Like, did you have any inkling of what it was that you were going through yourself?
I think that I knew that I was deeply sad. Like that was the way I
Mm-hmm.
would have described it at that time. That I was just incredibly sad, and um, I was a very innocent kid. Like I literally was one of those kids who would, draw pictures of their family and put them on the fridge. There's mom and dad, and there's me in the middle between my two sisters, and everybody's a little stick figure holding hands. Like I had a very simplistic view of family, but really counted on the solidity of that, right? That was a core piece of who I was, and a core piece of what I wanted in my own life. Like I can remember thinking, oh, I'm going to grow up, and I'm gonna, my dad was very I would say he was a real feminist. Actually, he wanted us to grow up and have careers, and would always say to us, don't be a nurse. If you want to be a nurse, don't be a nurse, be a doctor. Like don't set your bar too low just because of gender and things. So he was very progressive in that sense. But I remember thinking it was the first time I could remember understanding that adults were lying, right? Like the adult, like the doctor, my mom, even my dad, by not talking about it, they were all lying. And I guess I kind of got that they were lying on my behalf, but I didn't really understand why. I didn't understand why the lie needed to be there. But I was, supposed to keep the lie in place too. Like if my friends ask, say, "Oh yeah, I have mono, so I can't go to school." So yeah, it was that I remember that was kind of it was very, I guess in today's terminology we'd call that stigmatizing, but it it made me feel, to your question, Salima, it made me feel that the feelings I was having were not legitimate, and that having a level of sadness around a change in my life that was not within my control was something that I was supposed to just buck up and take and move on as though nothing had happened, and I just wasn't able to do that.
Right. So that's a lot as a 10-year-old to be sitting there with all of that. How did you only stay at your mom's home, or did you end up spending any time at your dad's home?
Oh yeah, there was. I mean, the my parents were great about, not fighting out their divorce in the child custody realm. That's not to say it was an amicable divorce, but it was, at least they didn't sort of bar people from kids from seeing their other parent or anything like that that you hear such sad stories
Mm-hmm.
about. But yeah, we were back and forth, so we did visit my dad every second weekend, and shared months and shared alternated holidays and all those kinds of things. But in truth, I think in some ways that was almost harder because every 2 weeks I would go back to the house that I'd grown up in, be in the neighborhood with friends that I had grown up with. But everything had changed at the same time. My friends knew that my parents weren't together. They knew on Sunday night I had to leave again. Um, yeah, it was just all different. The house looked different, different furniture, different things. And of course, my parents' lives were also moving on. So my dad remarried first, and then my mom remarried later. So it was, lots of
Mm-hmm.
change came in the 10 years following that.
Right. And what was it like being back at your dad's home after, with all of the changes, after the family dynamic changes? How did you cope with that?
Well, I think um, initially the back and forth was really difficult because you would be in the space that used to feel like your ultimate sanctuary, right? Your family home, as especially when you're a 10-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
That's the
Mm-hmm.
safest place, or for me in my growing up was the safest place I knew. I know that's not true for all children. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't the same once they were separated. That structure, that invisible structure of family was gone. And so it was almost more
Mm-hmm.
painful to be there because, it, I had to leave my dad every Sunday, or every second Sunday, and he was sad and we were sad. And it, go back to my mom's. And it wasn't that we didn't love my mom and I didn't have I had a good relationship with my mom, but uh,
Mm-hmm.
that void was tough. And I think after 2 or 3 years, I actually approached my mom about moving back and saying, could I go and live with dad? And my younger sister wanted to go with me. So she and I were very close. And she said, if Chris wants to go, then I'm going to go too. Um, and I think that must have been incredibly hard for my mom. But I think she knew at that point it was going to be the best thing for me. That was going to help create some comfort, some stability, a better balance for me, et cetera. And so I stayed and lived with my dad through the balance of my senior public school years and right through high school. And my mom was still in the neighborhood. She stayed close, and what didn't really sort of leave the neighborhood until after my sister and I were, well into high school, and then she moved into downtown Toronto.
Wow. Okay. So going back to the mono, right? Knowing what I mean, at the time, you knew that what you were feeling and what you were experiencing was not mono. You might not have known specifically that there was a mental health component, but knowing what you know now in hindsight, would you say that your symptoms might have been consistent with like a depressive episode or?
Yeah, I would. I do think it was a depressive episode, and I think because for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is I acutely remember the deep feelings of sadness. I also remember um, I wanted to be out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, intellectually, even as a 10 and 11-year-old, I didn't want to be feeling that way, but I couldn't wish myself out of it. And I remember how challenging a feeling that was, that I could not make myself feel better. And I think that so there was sort of this knowledge that I couldn't make myself feel better. And I think the other thing that sort of stands out for me from that time is I remember feeling almost, um, I want to say almost out of body. I can remember sort of sitting back and almost like I was observing myself and saying, huh, you're here on the couch again, and you're watching General Hospital and everybody else is coming home from school and you're here. How come we can't get you there? Like almost in this observational space about my own life. And and I've had that recur as an adult, where I feel myself, um, having another episode of depression or struggling to stay out of one. And as soon as I start to have that feeling, that's a real warning sign for me. Um, anyway, sorry. So I kind of jumped ahead, but yeah, looking at it now, I don't think we even had the terminology of mental health back then. I don't think I knew what depression was. Probably the only thing I knew about depression was, that there was this character in the Peanuts cartoons that kind of walked around with a black cloud over his head sometimes. And that was the articulation of kind of how I was feeling. Like I really just felt like there was this dark cloud over me a lot of the time, and I couldn't find my happy anymore.
So, knowing what you know now and this depressive episode and what you kind of experienced as, preteen, young teen, when else did you notice it show up in your life? What other points?
It's interesting that as I sit back and kind of observe my own life, if I looked at it along a timeline, um, I think that I've struggled with that same episodic experience a couple of times, and they seem to be related around major changes in my life. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know everybody struggles a little bit when they've got change in their life, but um, I struggled in my first year of university. So I was, it was a massive change. I went
Mm-hmm.
from, a small town-ish high school where, you knew all everybody in your class and the graduating class very well, to a very large university in downtown Toronto, and feeling like a very small fish in a very huge pond, and not really having social networks and connections there, and really struggled in my first year of university. Um, I struggled after the birth of my first son, my first child, and absolutely know that it was postpartum depression, but didn't have a doctor who was either savvy enough or cared enough to really ask the questions that needed to be asked around how I was coping following his birth. And my husband was amazing, and just kind of stuck with me, and just kept me sane during that time. But I look back now and recognize that I was deep in the throes of postpartum depression, and it was undiagnosed. Um, and that was really the last time, because I think that after his birth and going through that, I started to see the pattern, and I started to recognize the signs that when I'm in a situation where I don't have control of the outcome, um, it can be a real trigger for me. And if I think back, the divorce, I didn't have any control over the outcome of that. The change in my environment and university, although I'd chosen to go to university, it actually wasn't the university that was my first choice. I was very much influenced by my dad's saying that that was the best choice for me. I wanted to go to a smaller university where a bunch of my friends had been going, and uh, he didn't want me to do that. Um, and then, and obviously the choice to have a child was absolutely mine, but I think that was a lot more around hormones and massive change of lifestyle. I'd gone from being an entrepreneur with a really active career to a stay-at-home mom, and just that that's like hitting a brick wall, you're in terms of the change to who you are and what you're doing.
Right. Yeah. So it really has shown up in different parts of your life. And, once you could start to recognize those signs and patterns, as you mentioned, that you felt were really consistent with what you know now as postpartum, after recognizing all of that, recognizing that pattern, I'm curious about how things showed up for you when you had more awareness. Did anything change?
Yeah, for sure. I think that I think particularly after the postpartum, um, I started to recognize, behaviors that would start to appear for me that were signs. So I'm a pretty routine person. Like I like order, and I like, I'm not like super rigid, but I do get up at the same time every day. I like, I like to exercise. I like to walk. I like to be with people, etc. And when I'm starting to have sort of episodes emerge, I notice I start to shut those things down. So, the sleeping in, the not getting out of bed's a big one for me, like wanting to just lie in bed and read a book all day, or not engaging in my life. Definitely a sign. Overeating is a big sign for me. So, losing control of my capacity to regulate my diet in a healthy way, using food as almost a sedative to the emotions that I'm starting to feel. Um, Overeating, eating a lot of sugary food, binging. When I was in university, it was binge drinking. Um, all things that in my mind were sort of um, behaviors that to me started to try and squelch down that feeling of sadness, and and aren't healthy ways to squelch down the feeling of sadness.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's all of the stuff that you became more aware of in terms of your behaviors when you started to recognize those patterns. And after your first son, did you have any other children?
I did. I had a second boy.
You had a second
Um,
boy. Did you
yep.
experience anything like your first?
I didn't. Not Definitely not to the same degree, but um, I do think, to one of the comments you made earlier, the understanding of the symptoms and what's causing them,
Mm-hmm.
you start to become a little bit more resilient, and your recognition of the symptoms helps, right? It's So if I noticed that I was feeling overwhelmed because of the fatigue, because babies take a lot of energy out of you, and physically and mentally, and the sleep deprivation in particular is tough for me. uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think I learned to, first of all, to talk to my husband about what was going on. So if I'm exhausted, to say, listen, I'm exhausted. I just need a nap. Like, I got to go for 40 minutes. If I go 40 minutes and go lie down, I'm going to be a new woman when I wake up. And being
Right.
able to articulate to your support network around you what you
Mm-hmm.
really need.
Right.
What I learned that lesson after the postpartum, to really talk to people when you're struggling.
Mm-hmm. So, who was part of your support system when you had your second child? Who was part of that support system?
Well, even with my first, so I would say my mother didn't live in the country. My mom was in the U.S. at that point, and my mother-in-law was actually very present. And my husband and I were both new parents with our first one, and babies can have these crazy hours where they're kind of colicky and
Mm-hmm.
challenging, and
Mm-hmm.
she would just kind of magically appear some nights at sort of 5:30, 6 o'clock at night, and say, you know what, just dropped in to take him for a walk. And she'd just like take the baby. And
Nice.
I don't know if my husband, I should ask my husband, I don't know if my husband had shared that that was a particularly
Mm-hmm.
difficult time. He was getting home
Mm-hmm.
from work, he was tired, I was tired from being with the baby all day and wanted to
Mm-hmm.
hand the baby over to somebody else, and he was
Right.
so tired from his work that he wasn't always in the best frame of mind to take on a baby who was fussy at that point. But I can remember her just showing up and saying, "Oh, I just was in the neighborhood. I thought I'd put him in his pram." She was English, I put him in his pram and take him for a walk. And it was a lifesaver. It truly was. And she used to joke and talk to me about how it was when she raised her kids, and funny little English things, like they would put them in their little prams and their carriages, and she said, we used to put them out at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and just give them a little shake until they fell asleep, and we'd leave them there sleeping outside in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
In the modern world, you're like, what? You left a baby in the garden? Nobody would do that in the modern world, but it was a different time,
Right.
right? And it was the
Yes.
50s, not the
Right.
20s, or the
Right.
2000s. So, and all the moms
Mm-hmm.
would get together with tea and macaroons, and I was just like, well, where was your baby monitor? And there was no baby monitor. They didn't
Right.
have that level of attentiveness to the babies. They just trusted that the baby was safe in the pram, and that was it. So,
Right.
but I think that that was a tremendous support to me. And my mom was
Mm-hmm.
great. Like, my mom was not able to be there physically, but she was
Mm-hmm.
she was and is a great grandma, and was very
Mm-hmm.
supportive, and very good at sort of saying, listen, you can't take on the world. Like, you've got to just take care of the baby. If the laundry piles up, the laundry piles up. Don't worry about it. And trying to talk me out of my natural desire to want everything to be perfect all the time.
Mm-hmm. And did you have different medical support the second time around?
I did. I did have a better doctor, better pediatrician. By then, I had a good relationship with a pediatrician as well, who had became our pediatrician when we had our first, when he was about a year old, and then when we had our second son, we continued to see that same pediatrician, and he was smart. Like, he knew that women struggled. He could tell. He knew my first wasn't even sleeping through the night yet by the time
Mm-hmm.
I had my second, and was just very compassionate, very normalizing. That every kid's different. Your kids don't have to be doing what other kids are doing around sleep, but try this, try that. And he checked in a lot, like with moms. I found
Mm-hmm.
when we went in for our regular checkups with the kids, he would be checking in with the moms,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that was society becoming more aware, the medical
Right.
community becoming more
Mm-hmm.
aware that
Mm-hmm.
women struggle.
Right.
There had been a really sad situation with postpartum depression in between my first and second children, where um, a woman died by suicide with her baby, and I think that it really shook not only the people of our city, but it also it really shook, I think, medical practitioners who worked with moms, um, and kind of made them pay attention. Don't assume somebody's okay.
And how were you impacted? How were you impacted by that story when that happened in your community?
Yeah, it made me really sad. I mean, it happened. I guess it happened just after I'd had my second, and so having been through the experience of postpartum, having come through it, and then having my second with me, I was just I just felt so sad for her, for her family, because I was very conscious that kind of there, but for the grace of God go I, was one thought I had. But the other thought I had was how much she was going to miss. That when you're in that, when you're feeling that depressed, it's like being in a room and all the curtains are drawn and you can't figure out how to open the curtains. And you don't even have the will to open the curtains. And, um, and I thought, that if there was a way to guide somebody around how to open the curtains, she could see out the window and see this isn't how it's going to be forever. This is just right now, and your life is going to be good, and your relationship with your children is going to be fantastic, and there's going to be so many moments of joy in raising them. And I just thought how sad it was that she wasn't going to see that.
What did after hearing that story, after living through that and experiencing that sadness, did anything emerge differently for you after that?
I started paying attention to all the joyous moments. My husband used to tease me, that every day he'd come home from work and I'd tell him funny stories about the kids and what they'd been up to that day, and who put spaghetti on their head, and all the silly little moments that are part of parenting. And he really encouraged me. I'd always written a journal. I'd published a few short stories and things like that. And he said, you really should write some of this stuff down, because parents would enjoy it. Like, there's a real commonality to parenting, and you see it. Parents standing around at the playground or at the wading pool, or in the balcony and watching their kids at swimming lessons and sharing the funny moments. And so I did start writing. I wrote a few columns, that were picked up by our local newspaper, um, and it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek column called "Life on the Child Side" instead of "Life on the Wild Side," kind of like he gave up the wild side in favor of being a parent. And it ran in our local newspaper, the Beach Metro News, for almost 10 years. Actually, it ran until my kids could read, because when they were at the capacity that they could read the column, they started to realize that I was splashing their lives all over a local newspaper with 33,000 readers, and they weren't very happy about that. So once they could read, I kind of got banned from telling anybody about their lives. But it was extremely therapeutic for me. And I didn't just write about all the funny moments. I mean, a lot of them are very poignant moments, that have sadness in them. Like losing grandparents, and kids moving on from stages in their lives that are wonderful stages, but everybody grows up. They're not toddlers anymore, and they lose their teeth, and they move on, and they move away from you as a parent. And just helped me to kind of process that stuff, but kind of process it with a community of other parents.
I'm sure it was so well received, and I'm sure it was quite valuable to many parents. Sounds like you had a lot of fun with it too, which is the best part.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, Christine, When people come to see me in the therapy room, individuals typically, they're usually in one of three places when they're embarking on any particular part of their healing journey. And I don't mean overall like the journey of life, but in a particular area that they're working on. And so some people, when they come to me, they're at the beginning stages where they have no idea where to start, or they know they need to get started somewhere, or they're in the middle, they're like right in the thick of things. It's a current right now problem that's happening, or they're looking back, maybe looking for closure or looking for introspection or looking for a way to make peace in a way that they can move forward. So what part of the journey would you say that you are in? Would you say that you are getting started, in the middle, or looking back?
Well, I'm sure from the discussion today it would sound like I'm looking back, but I actually
I don't make assumptions. That's why
I
I'm asking about all three stages. All
I
of them.
think I'm kind of in the later stages of that middle stage. The only reason I say that is that I think it would be the ultimate arrogance to say that I'm never going to be faced with this again. I really do think that depression is like a town that I keep circling back to. Like I move away and then I come back sometimes. And
Mhm.
it's not
Okay.
that it's always bad because I think there's always learning that comes out of it. I think there's always
Mhm.
a moment of self-awareness for me that there's something going on in my life that I
Mhm.
don't feel in control of, and that's what's making me feel unwell. Um, Kind of like you recognize you've got a cold, you've got a sore throat and runny eyes and a runny nose, and you suddenly say, "Oh, look, I've got a cold." I'll have those moments occasionally, and I think that I just recognize them.
So it's like you have symptoms of what you know now is symptoms of depression. So you know that you have these things, and it's like, okay, so what are the things that I need to do to keep this under control, to manage it, to be able to keep functioning?
Exactly. And I do think of it almost like a cold, like
Mhm.
if you know you have all these symptoms and you don't take care of yourself,
Mhm.
it just gets worse and then
Mhm.
you end up with bronchitis or something like that.
Mhm.
So I try to pay attention to the early symptoms, and I try to treat them. If it's something that I can change in the structure of my life,
Mhm.
I'll take the steps to change it. If it is something that I can't change and I'm just going to have to live through,
Mhm.
then like my mother-in-law having cancer,
Mhm.
then I'll just make sure that I've got good health practices
Mhm.
in place, not just for my mental health, but my physical health, my
Right.
social health.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's financial health. People
Mhm.
have financial challenges
Right.
too. So I just try to build those pieces in, and I really do think that social health is a huge part of that. So having people you can talk to, whether it's a professional, a clinician, somebody in an EAP, friends to me have been huge, and friends that have known you for a long time and can support you in a positive way, and family too. And my family is tremendously supportive.
Right. And so, on that note, what is your key message to the listeners of the show?
First of all, you're braver than you think you are. And you have deeper capacity than I think we all have deeper capacity than we give ourselves credit for.
Mhm.
So, you're going to be okay as long as you remember that this is a journey, that there's going to be hills and there's going to be valleys, and
Mhm.
the valleys don't go forever and the hills don't last forever either. So,
Mhm.
you can have a great view at the top,
Mhm.
but there's probably still stuff to learn in the valley as well. And just keep going.
Mhm.
Like, just keep going. You put one foot in front of the other, you keep going, and
Mhm.
you ask for help when you need it.
Awesome. I love the analogy with the hills and the valleys. I'm going to steal that one again. Another one of your points I'm stealing. Okay, I'm curious. What was game changing for you in terms of inspiration that perhaps reflects your untold story? Is there like an event, a book, a quote, a mantra, something that kind of helped to anchor you?
You know what? I've been inspired by a lot of people in my life, and I I kept thinking about other people that I knew had survived worse things than I had, and that was what inspired me. I thought about my grandmother who lived in London with two young children um, during World War II, you know, and didn't know where her husband was, didn't know if he was alive or dead, and had to go on every day, one foot in front of the other, dealing with whatever was going on in the society in London. and every night bombs falling on their heads. And I'd go to bed every night during COVID going, there's no bombs falling on my head. Like I'm safe. Like where I am right now, I'm safe. I just have to keep that in mind. Um, I think that in my work, I've had the tremendous good fortune to meet so many inspiring people who have struggled with mental health and to your point, have dared to share their story, whether they're peer supporters or whether they are Paralympians or they are just people that I work with every day, clinicians and colleagues who are in the business of helping other people every day because they themselves have struggled. And I find that very inspiring. So, there's no like one big celebrity that I look at and think fantastic. It's really people and regular people in my life.
Okay, so what's a cause or organization that has been impactful to you on your journey that you would like to give a shout out to?
Uh, I'd like to give a shout out to my colleagues at
Mm-hmm.
what used to be Morneau Chappelle is now called LifeWorks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so many people that I've learned so much from, clinicians and peers. I think in this time of COVID, I'd also be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the frontline and first responders that I know have really been up against it. And I personally get a lot of support out of Weight Watchers. So they're now WW is what they call themselves now, but I think that they, for me, have really embodied really the concept of taking care of your whole self. It's not, not just about food. So for me, food is not, food isn't an addiction. It's a mechanism I use to soothe myself. And they really focus on making sure that you're, as a human being, that you're well, that you're taking care of yourself psychologically as well as physically. And that's been very helpful to me.
Okay, so what are your social handles if someone wants to connect with you, if people want to connect with you? How can they?
Yeah, for sure. Easiest one for sure is LinkedIn.
Okay.
So, that's definitely the space where from a professional but also a personal perspective, I often post about mental health things that I think are going to be helpful for people.
Any other
Um,
platforms?
I do also I'm on Instagram and Facebook, so people are welcome to connect with me on both of those if they want to. Instagram, you're going to see a lot of pictures of my puppy, so just be warned, he's also part of the mental health package. And yeah, so those are the ones that I would say are the most.
Okay. And we'll grab those handles from you.
Sure,
So the show notes page will have all of the details for people to link and get connected with you
sounds great.
for sure. Okay. So, Christine, guess what?
Guess what? What?
You have just dared yourself to share. Congratulations, Christine.
Well, I feel like, see, I'm going to date myself. I feel like Evil Knievel. Can I get an outfit and a motorcycle now?
Absolutely. Let's try and arrange that.
Well, thank you. I just want to say thank you. It's a tremendous honor to be asked, and I'm really grateful for the time that you put into this. I'm sure you're helping a lot of people, Salima, by sharing other people's stories.
Thank you, Christine. It actually means quite a bit to me. I'm that you say those kind words and share that with me. In fact, I'm grateful for how you showed up with your daredevil energy and speaking so genuinely about how mental health has shown up throughout your life and how you've combated it, worked with it, and really transformed your life and taken other struggles and created transformation, and it's just so beautiful to see how it has transpired for you. And talking about for what some may consider as a common struggle, it really needed to be told, Christine, because it's these very stories that don't get told, they get missed. So, once again, Christine, thank you for being part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.